Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to our 7th lecture in the series on the Introduction to Family and Kinship. Today we are going to look at the idea of the new studies in family and kinship. Ever since the canonical classical study of kinship has looked at blood and marriage, we have now embarked on a study of how blood and marriage has come to be reconfigured. Is it possible to think of kinship beyond these two categories? Is it possible to think of kinship in a more dynamic form? In the last lecture, we had discussed Janet Carsten's idea of relatedness. Relatedness, as we discussed, has within it plural ideas of relating, relationships, and how we think of our relatives. This is now being extended to look at how contemporary forms of kinship and family may include other kinds and ways of thinking. The new kinship studies in that sense begins with the seminal volume by Sarah Franklin and Susan McKinnon, known as Relative Values. In their volume, they lay out how the importance of biology has continued to inform the study of kinship despite its critical reflection, despite the constant negotiation with the idea of biology. They suggest that biology remains the underpinning to the study of kinship even in contemporary society, but the way in which we renegotiate the study is what we will be looking at in this particular lecture. To begin with, Daniel Miller, who has written on the impact of consumption and society and how people think of themselves through acts of economic buying and selling, talks of how relationships have changed in contemporary societies. Daniel Miller refers to the processual, fluid nature of relationships to understand why it is important to think of kinship in the contemporary world in a more dynamic form. Miller is critical of the way in which biology and marriage continue to frame our reference points. However, Miller understands that to move beyond these also requires an imagined reworking of our notion of kin. To move beyond our stable notions of kin is to also engage with a more inherent idea of what forms our notion of relationships. Here, Miller is very interested in looking at the idea of how, for instance, immigrant workers from across the world travel to other parts of the world and make meaning in their current positions. He refers to the work of Russell, Parenas, and others to understand how kinship is worked and reworked constantly. In this lecture, specifically, we are going to look at some new modes of thinking about kin and kinship. One of the most important ways of thinking through the new ways of looking at kinship is that of the alternative form. Levine, in his landmark article on alternative forms of kinship, continues to say that while biology forms the bulwark to our understanding of kinship, the reframing of the new is also in relation to biology. We are engaged with looking at and through our own understanding of what biology means in the contemporary world. Here it is important to note that Euro-American kinship models continue to frame our reference points, which is why in this lecture I am going to begin with certain important negotiations with the idea of biology to then build on how we think of the non-biological or the alternative forms of kinship when we look at places like India. Does the Euro-American model necessarily speak back to a more indigenous model of procreation and kinship? Can we think of anything beyond biology? Or are we relegating the non-Western models of kinship to an alternative form themselves? These are important questions that we seek to understand and identify with, and they require deeper engagement through the work of ethnographic relevance. Here, I must insist that emerging ethnographies are providing newer idioms and tools of looking at kinship. As we shall see in this lecture, ethnography itself is changing in looking through how we can imagine relationships. classical ethnography is not of the same relevance anymore as it was found in Levi-Strauss's work or that of Radcliffe Brown. Ethnography itself has become a mode by which the ethnographer or anthropologist is constantly reworking his or her idea of thinking through kin and kinship. In this lecture, we will look at some seminal ethnographies which have displaced the classical idea of kin and kinship to understand and push us to think more about our relationships. This means a newer engagement with the older ideas. We cannot completely disregard or discard the notion of blood, biology, marriage and kin, but need to re-engage with them in newer forms and newer places. This may lead to a subversion or a complete unsettlement, unpacking of biology, but at the end of the day we need to see if we can approach relationships anew through other categories. To begin with, the most seminal work in Western kinship has been that of Kath Western. Kath Western's book on Families We Choose looks at how gay and lesbian kinship becomes an important part of looking at relationships in San Francisco. Her work looks at contemporary day ideas of alternative forms of relating. In this sense, the alternative form of relationship becomes embedded, however, again in the idea of the biological procreative family. Therefore, Kath Western suggests that in social imaginings, the gay and lesbian family is primarily identified through its sexuality, an idea which is not completely honest and in relevance to how they actually live their lives. Gay and lesbian communities in San Francisco have reimagined kinship by a restructuring of their own place within society. They constantly position their own sense of self in opposition to their own kin who are biologically related. Thus, in Kath Western's work, interestingly, the gay and lesbian family is positioned in opposition to that of the biological family. This becomes even more important considering that many of gay lesbian couples are rejected by their own families who, on finding out about their alternative sexuality, kick them out of their homes. This rejection of the biological family means that they must seek out other people they can relate to. These are people they may be friends with or create networks of ties with, and not necessarily people who are only their lovers. This form of connectedness therefore becomes juxtaposed in opposition to a very critical notion of what biology means. The gay and lesbian family positions itself categorically in the non-procreative space. As we all know, the most important role that the heterosexual family plays for society at large is procreation and the provision of new members for society. In opposition to that, the gay and lesbian family is unable to either procreate or provide new members and exists in that particular oppositional space. It is not that the gay and lesbian family is unhappy to claim that space, but actually uses it to reject dominant notions of being and relating. For them, the dominant notion of blood and biology has been both exclusionary and alienating. That their own biological kin have rejected them is important in making this opposition time and again. Thus, other people of similar sexual orientations come together in support and in times of dire need. The family of the family of choice, therefore, becomes critical to the way we think of our own selves and our relationships. We have to constantly reframe our meanings and modes of being within such a perspective. Kath Western's work was landmark in many ways because it provided new ways of thinking about close kin and family, especially when those you think are your closest family reject you from those bonds. Is it possible to think of other people who help and come to your aid as possible kin as opposed to those who are supposed to be related to you through blood? This is what Kath Western provokes you to think about constantly. In the process, she also questions the received idea of blood itself. If one constantly takes for granted the idea that blood and biological relatives are closer and will never engage in the act of rejection, or that simply put, blood relationships are forever and cannot be broken, how do gay and lesbian individuals and couples place themselves within such a structure? The idea that kinship is fragile, whether we like it or not, is very important to understand how we make newer relationships. In that sense, Kath Western suggests that we think of new ways and modes of being. With reference to my research on commercial surrogacy in India, the interesting role that gay couples play when they come to India to hire surrogates to have children also suggests that they seek biological connectedness. In an earlier lecture on Schneider, I referred to how he rejects the idea of an alternative form of kinship emerging through gay and lesbian families by suggesting that they are reenacting the same kind of script time and again. This is particularly relevant in understanding how we can constantly think through our own categories of relatedness and relationships. Why are gay and lesbian couples, despite rejecting a biological mode of being, seek to have children biologically too, by taking the help of new reproductive technologies or a surrogate? These are important questions that emerge while we continue to seek answers to the existing questions. In that sense, kinship remains dynamic in the way it constructs itself. Kath Western's work is resurrected, interestingly, in a very provocative article by the famous feminist Judith Butler, known as "Is Kinship Always Already Heterosexual?" Judith Butler is looking at the desire for gay marriage legitimacy across the world. She looks at this interesting interplay of legalization and marriage vis-a-vis our desire to legitimize our unions. For Butler, it is unseemly that a gay and lesbian community should seek to legitimize itself through those same norms that the state and society uphold. These are the same norms that have rejected gay and lesbian couples and their lifestyle. It becomes important, therefore, to think through what we understand by social norms. Primarily, Butler continues to assert, the norm and the normativized view of society and kinship is that of heterosexuality, where a man and woman must marry to procreate and have children for social good. In such an image, the gay family does not exist or cannot exist fruitfully. The desire for state legitimation, therefore, according to Judith Butler, is a desire for normativization. She suggests that when gay and lesbian couples seek to legitimize their unions by asking the state for support, they are seeking to fall back into the heterosexual mode of being. That is not revolutionary or against the norm, but actually falling back into the norm. Exactly what Schneider said too. Interestingly, in this process of seeking legitimacy, for instance, couples across the world, gay couples across the world, have also sought to have children through surrogacy and other reproductive technologies, or even through adoption. The act of adopting a child has been another form or method of seeking legislation through marriage. In many ways, this whole question of alternativeness has been constantly subsumed on gay and lesbian kinship. It is an interesting way to approach relationships and the way in which we think about them. Gay and lesbian kinship is beyond sexuality, both Butler and Western suggest, but it is also socially placed within the prism of sexuality, unfortunately. In Ruth Vanita's study of gay and lesbian marriages in India, she finds that homo narratives around gay and lesbian marriages in the media and the press continue to mark them as aberrant and abnormal. The state actively participates in the harassment of gay and lesbian couples because they do not meet the idealized notions of the norm. In that sense, gay and lesbian couples in India are like what Parvez Modi suggests, a non-community. Any and every young person who seeks to legitimize their union outside of community support and familial acceptance are marked through these ideas of aberration and abnormality. Interestingly, Judith Butler calls such a space as the non-place. The non-place within legislation is a marker of first the state's rapid interference in intimate life, and secondly in the way in which legitimation always remains elusive for those who occupy the non-place. The non-place is occupied not only by gay and lesbian couples seeking legitimacy, but also by others who occupy the fringes of society, such as migrants, refugees, women, transgenders, religious minorities, and others. This is critical in understanding how law and society work together in creating this space of non-negotiation, while at the same time promising the fringe that they will be given legitimacy. Such an idea works peculiarly in kinship because it continues to resurrect one particular norm. It is problematic in many ways, as Ruth Vanita finds in a study of gay and lesbian couples in India, noting how the suicide of young gay women in Kerala points to the way in which the escape from such normativizing discourse is through death. Thankfully, as we know, in 2018, the Supreme Court removed the problematic clause in IPC 377, which in many ways delegitimized homosexual unions and homosexuality itself. In many ways identified as a landmark judgment which aims to legitimize gay and lesbian relationship and the queer community. This is an important step in India to understand how people live and understand their relationships. Such a judgment is also a move towards looking at how gay and lesbian relationships are not only about sexuality, but about connectedness and networks of kin as well. In such a legitimation, the state is also suggesting that we must move away from dominant notions of what it is to be kin, that marriage and heterosexuality are not the only forms of kinship acceptable. This is particularly relevant when seen that in terms of Indian kinship systems, as we have studied, we do not necessarily follow a sense of the kin and kinship as it is followed in the West. We are not held in the clasp of the idea of biology and marriage in ways in which it cannot be moderated or worked successfully with, in fact. Thus, the idea of gay and lesbian kinship comes to be marked in a particular way through two notions, one of marriage and the other of the child. In many ways, the opposition to gay and lesbian kinship and to gay and lesbian marriages comes from the question of the best interests of the child. If the marriage of a gay couple is legitimized, the desire to have children means that these children will be brought up in non-normative households. Again, a problem in the understanding of what is dominant and what is not. The whole question of a child being brought up by two fathers or two mothers is indeed revolutionary, not anymore though, but its social sanctity does not make it always legitimate. So coming back to India, while we celebrate the Supreme Court's decision, we also know there's a long way to go for social acceptance to be given to gay and lesbian couples seeking to have a family and get married. Legal injunctions aside, social acceptability marks the way we think about kin and kinship as well, which is why in courts the best interest of the child becomes an important node to look at kinship and relationships. This is how we go into the analysis of the new ways of kinship and relationship, the new studies of kinship and relationships, where the idea of kinship is not stable anymore. We are not looking at models and ways of being anymore. Instead, we are provoked more towards thoughts of dissonance and conflict, as I mentioned in the last lecture. Here, the focus is strongly on how ideas such as non-normative marriages, non-normative relationships, divorce, and other forms of fission mark our understanding of kinship. No sense of modeling or cross-cousin marriage analysis can help us understand what is actually happening in reality and at the ground level. We have to reinstate our idea of what kinship means and what marriage means in thinking through these newer idioms of conceptualization. Thus, the study by Bob Simpson of divorce becomes critical in engaging with new studies of kinship and the family. Bob Simpson, in his study titled The Unclear Family, looks at how divorce in Britain has changed the ways in which we think about extended family and the nuclear family. If you recall from the last lecture, we had a long discussion on what the joint family in India meant. The conclusion to that lecture was rather ambiguous, but what I suggested at the end was that the family itself in India is constantly changing through different categories and meanings, and to designate it in one category of the joint or the nuclear would be incorrect. Similarly, in the West, in Bob Simpson's study, the idea of divorce itself creates newer ideas and newer engagements with what we think of constitutes the family. In discussing the unclear family, Bob Simpson suggests that divorce leads to a newer configuration of kin through remarriage or newer relationships and the birth of new members into society. His focus is particularly on how affinities can be remade and broken in the process of divorce. So kin are not those only through blood and marriage, but through broken marriages and the dissolution of past relationships. Here it becomes important to understand what divorce truly entails. Thus, to give you an example of what Bob Simpson refers to, he takes the example of Steve. Steve, as I'll show you here, forms the node of 3 relationships. This is Steve. Steve is interestingly linked to 3 women. His first relationship here, we don't know the name of the woman, led to the birth of his first son, who he is still attached to. His relationship, second marriage to Kath, which ended in divorce, led to the birth of 2 children. And his current relationship and marriage to Karen has led to the birth of 2 children as well. Interestingly, Steve lives with this family but continues to have very important relationships with his other 3 children. His children with Kath often visit and stay with his children that he has with Karen, and his first son from his first relationship is also an important part of this familial structure. In total, he has 5 children who are linked to each other through full and half siblingship. Within this formation, Karen's earlier relationship, which was not a marriage to another man and who she has split with, led to the birth of a daughter who is also part of this mix as a step sibling. Interestingly, while each one of these children think they are part of a larger conglomeration, their grandparents continue to differentiate between them. So while this is a family unit in itself, Karen's parents, interestingly, identify only these 3 as their children, A, B, C. For them, children born through Karen are their true grandchildren and not Steve's children through other women. However, Steve's parents continue to think of all 6 as legitimate grandchildren. This leads to some amount of strife between Steve and Karen, but it is important to understand how the family is thought of not only within this generation but the previous generation as well. Of importance within such an understanding is the way in which the family reconfigures itself after a divorce or a separation. In such a complicated setup, different sets of people identify different sets of people as kin. Despite Steve and Karen's desire to include all their children within one familial unit, the grandparents are unwilling to make that kind of a gesture. This does not mean that Karen and Steve's attempt at creating a family is falling apart. It only means that certain sets of kin are recognized at certain points of time. However, as a rule, Karen and Steve continue to exist with this large family in question. The permutations and combinations within this setup is what Bob Simpson is referring to as the unclear family. This is particularly important in how we think about our configurations and our familial ideas. Thus, when thinking about the idea of affinal relationships post-divorce, Bob Simpson refers to certain ideas of how ongoing physical contact between parents and children becomes a very important node of thinking through these relationships. It's also important that sustained financial support from the non-resident parent continue to be provided to the resident parent with the child. These two important nodes continue to mark post-divorce families in Britain. But here is where the state steps in again to make sure that these configurations exist and survive without acrimony or dissent. In the study of post-divorce families, Simpson identifies two particular types emerging. The first is the nuclear family. The nuclear family is a very interesting configuration that depends again on the post-divorce family and its ability to overcome dissent. Simpson refers to this particular example of Sue, where despite her best of efforts, she has to separate and divorce her husband, leaving with the two children she had with her husband and the stepchild she loves that belongs to her husband. On her remarriage with someone else, the stepchild has to go back to her husband and she remains with her children with her ex-husband and a new child with her new husband. Even while speaking, it confuses me. But this familial configuration has a lot of importance in the way it negotiates its post-divorce idea. According to Bob Simpson, post-divorce households that attempt to reconciliate and have a situation like that I mentioned with Steve and Karen, unfortunately may not always be able to do so. Here there are two or three different types of conflict that emerge. The first is that of the discontinuities that emerge post-divorce despite wanting to have a continuity with both sets of families, the family you had with your ex-partner and the family you have with your current partner. The second problem that emerges is the breaking of the ties between the husband and wife, which brings the tie of the parent and the child under huge pressure. So Sue, for instance, Sue's daughter from her ex-husband refuses to acknowledge her father, instead preferring her stepfather, who gives her more attention and love. This becomes a sore point for Sue's ex-husband, who decides that Sue has been poisoning her daughter against him. Now, these are important ways in which the post-divorce family tries to think of itself. So, the biggest role that comes under the scanner in the post-divorce nuclear household is that of the pater-genitor link. As we all know, the pater is the social father and the genitor is the biological father. In most cases, as we understand, the pater-genitor is the same person. But as we can see in case of post-divorce families, the pater-genitor role may be split in cases where the mother remarries. In such situations, children have to fight out in the identification of who the real father figure in their life is. Recent films in Hollywood also talk about this constant strife that men have to undergo to identify themselves as husbands and fathers to multiple families. The post-divorce nuclear family, therefore, is negotiating with the idea of how to place patrifiliation within conjugal love and affinity. This is a very difficult enterprise, as the apparent weakness, of the conjugal tie means that the parent-child tie also comes under extreme and intense pressure. As we understand from from the classical framing of biology and marriage, according to Schneider, is based on a code of conduct which is not for the lifetime. It is a legal relationship which can be broken and remade again. However, in our social identification of the biological role, it is forever and cannot be broken. However, as we have already seen in case of Kath Weston's analysis, it can be rejected. But in case of divorce, the biological role continues to have that kind of social preeminence for the children, where they seek to continue their relationship with their biological father, but are unable to do so in case of the unsettlement of their parents' marriage. The nuclear household, therefore, post-divorce provides huge amounts of pressure for the family to continue in a sense of amicability. However, many families are unable to continue that way and again reframe themselves to what they were, nuclear units of parents and children, often leading to a huge difference between the biological father and the children. But there are also cases that Bob Simpson mentions where the post-divorce family might actually become a larger extended family, what he calls the extending family. They are not extended in a fixed sense, but continue to form and reform themselves. The extending family depends a lot on friends and other kin to give support. Here, your close common friends might come to aid you in continue to negotiate with your ex-spouse regarding your relationship with your children. In another case that Simpson mentions, the ex-spouses, despite huge acrimony and dissent, aim to come together for the sake of their children so that they may participate in their children's upbringing and growth. Here, friends are not just common friends that the couple share, but also and often the couple's parents. The couple's parents may step in to help reclaim or reinvigorate a relationship which is otherwise dead. In such situations, polite socialization and engagement with your post-divorce family becomes very important. Negotiations also include taking into confidence your new biological and conjugal family so that there is no further dissent or acrimony. Within such a setting, Bob Simpson notes that relatives are more individuals than relatives. The desire to continue is based on particular relations, but may also depend on whether you seek to have that person in your life or not. Thus, individual affection, admiration and respect are important nodes by which the extending family continues to stay together. In such a situation of the post-divorce milieu, Bob Simpson finds that we are increasingly coming into the foray of the unclear family. Here, boundaries are not defined as clearly as we think they should be, and they are constantly changing and rechanging. That is not to insist that the family is growing, but they are also rejecting members from within their fold. It is important, therefore, to understand how we can imagine and rethink through our categories of the familial. Thus, some of the features that Bob Simpson identifies vis-a-vis the unclear family are particularly important here for our understanding. Simpson identifies the following features. The first is the identification of a private domain which plays into the hands of the public. The state's relationship with the family becomes more and more important even in the post-divorce era, where they actually come into the picture to figure out how the family should be configured. This is an intervention that one may like or dislike, but is here to stay. Similarly, the economy plays a very important part in how we think about the post-divorce family. Thus, interestingly, the question of money and inheritance rights or the separation of common assets is never discussed during a marriage, but becomes very important on divorce, where the couple decides who gets what after splitting up. This is also an idea that we will discuss later after this through the theorist Viviana Zelizer, where our ideas of kin and money or commerce are something that we do not want to mix. But they exist in our understanding of kinship and kinning, as is seen in the post-divorce relationship, where the couple, the ex-spouses, are actively involved in deciding their common assets and dividing them. The other very important feature of the post-divorce unclear family is how there is a sanitization of divorce itself. Bob Simpson notes that divorce is not as ugly and acrimonious anymore. It has become more and more bourgeois. in a sense, a more fluid process that is part of one's life cycle. Courts, states, family, kin, and children try to make this process as smooth as possible for all parties concerned, so that divorce itself becomes a less painful and less conflicted process. This is also to acknowledge that divorce has become a part of our kinship map. It has become an increasingly important part of how we think of our kin and kinship. Marriage is not for keeps, as we understand, but something that can be dissolved and that is understood and part of our own consideration of kin and relationships. Thus, within such a system, the post-divorce family is increasingly dependent on how we think of our extended family as well and who comes to our aid. Networks of children, friends, neighbors, and other family kin are very important to understand how the unclear family comes into existence. Most importantly here, we have to understand that in contemporary society, families negotiate constantly with the idea of how to work through intimacy. One of the things that the new kinship studies is heavily invested in is this idea of intimacy itself. We do not speak and we have not spoken of intimacy within kinship because till date we have been discussing through models of accepted social behavior. Models do not include a negotiation with intimacy, even though we did touch on the idea of intimacy in Cast 10 study of relatedness. Relatedness, through its various meanings and different substances, does underlie a recognition to be given to intimacy and its various modes of being. Contemporary relationships, on the other hand, depend heavily on the idea of intimacy, whether through love or through the exchange of certain gifts. This is important in understanding Viviana Zelazer's theory of the purchase of intimacy. She suggests that unlike our conceptualization of intimacy, kin, and money, real life actually involves an easy exchange of all of these items. Our constant horror of the mixing of the economy and of our intimate relationships is based on this idealized role of hostile worlds where commerce and economics are in one space and family and intimacy is in the other. Viviana Zelazer suggests that the fear of mixing commerce or economy with intimate relationships is closely linked to other ideas of prostitution and sex work or the exchange of money for intimate relationships, which are seen as socially abhorrent. However, Zelazer notes that every form of intimate kin relationship has an element of commerce and economics added to it. These are usually added under euphemisms or hidden meanings, for instance, the act of gift giving itself. Bourdieu has a very critical and important example to suggest in terms of gift giving. Bourdieu suggests that when we give a gift to a person, we scratch out the price that the gift has at the back of it because we don't want the recipient to know the value of the gift being given. This is an act of euphemism, it's an act of hiding because at the one level you want to hide how much you've spent on the gift. At the another level, you also don't want the gift to be reduced to its economic value, therefore putting the relationship under threat. Those who actually leave the price tag on the gift are not seen in very positive terms. The idea is that the gift is truly a gift and does not seek a return. If we go back to North Indian marriage systems, the gift is in one way only unidirectional and does not seek a return, but it has other ideas of exploitation linked to it that mar relationships. Similarly, when we think of intimacy, intimacy too has an underlying concept of commerce to it. Viviana Zelazer suggests in a very dangerous mode of thinking through intimacy and hostile worlds that the giving of the engagement ring is also a purchase of the woman's sexuality. It is an interesting way to think through our notions of economics and kin relations. In a new book by Wendy Doniger, Doniger explores how mythology has always played with the idea of commerce and intimacy. She looks at Greek, Hindu, and other myths to understand the way in which the ring keeps playing itself out in different narratives across the world to show how intimate relations and the exchange of jewelry and money are an important terrain of how we think of our family and kinship. Even though we do not expressly want to think about money and economics and exchange, we are very much embedded in this relationship of discomfort where money and family are brought together. Within such an understanding of intimacy and new kinship, we embark on a study of Indian kinship as well. Indian kinship, though, has not followed the terrain of the classical terrain of how we think of biology, it nonetheless continues to fall back on a Euro-American model. This might primarily be because most of our anthropologists have emerged from the West. Let us look at the books we have done till now. We have looked at Levi-Strauss, we have looked at Dumont, we have looked at Cecilia Busby and at Janet Carsten, and also at Troutman and others, who are all European anthropologists who studied Indian kinship systems. A part of their manifest understanding of kinship systems is therefore marked by their own understanding of kinship, which is very Western and embedded on the opposition between biology and the social. Within India itself, thus, new contemporary analysis of kinship and marriage throws up very interesting ways of being and becoming. Here I look critically at three interesting studies, one by Parvez Modi, the other by Ravinder Kaur, and the third by Shalini Grover. Parvez Modi's study of the intimate state has been seen as a new landmark study of the way in which we think of marriage in India. She looks at how the state actively interferes in understanding and in reframing marriages. These are not marriages as we have been studying till now. These are not cross-cousin marriages or marriages of gifting and affinal relationships. These are marriages outside the understanding of community and traditional ties within India. These are marriages that happen between individuals and mimic a Western idea of love and affection. In India, Parvez Modi notes, a sense of love jurisdiction marks the way marriages are framed. Thus, she refers to how love jurisdiction takes on the colloquial meaning of love or pyar to engage with the way in which lawyers and court justices think of using laws to think of pyar, prem and love. This reframing of love jurisdiction is most marked when young couples seek to engage in love marriages outside their familial and community support. In her extensive ethnographic study of a court in Delhi where love marriages are sanctified through court legislation, she finds that the difficult terrain that couples have to fulfill to get married has an important signification for the way in which we think about society. Modi's work is very interestingly translatable to what we have been discussing in terms of what Western and Judith Butler have been speaking about. In the sense of the non-normativeness of the gay and lesbian relationship, Modi finds that in India, the relationship that a couple share out of love and affection is also non-normative. In India, marrying by codes of community and family are more important than seeking individual fulfillment. This does not mean that the state supports love marriages either. This actually means that the state connives and supports families in stopping young couples from having love marriages. However, here a crucial distinction exists. Parvez Modi aims to suggest that while the state in India connives to make court marriages and love marriages difficult for couples to enter into, legislation itself is more liberal towards such kind of marriages. Thus, as per two important laws, the Special Marriage Act of 1954 and the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955, couples are allowed to marry outside of the familial fold in court and legitimize their union. The Special Marriage Act of 1954 especially is very landmark because it aims to cut across community, class, religious and other forms of divide to assure young couples of the state's support when they seek to get married. However, the way such laws work are difficult to understand in the Indian setting. Parvez Modi finds that those couples who marry through these laws and acts or marry in court become part of what she identifies as the non-community. This as an idea is similar to what has been discussed, if you recall, by Judith Butler when she talks about the non-space. The non-community of young couples who go outside of their family and community to get married in court refers to them as being alien or excluded from social bonds. They again occupy the position of the periphery within social systems, which is constantly threatening their sense of self and their relationship. Being a non-community is a very dangerous space to be in. It is both liminal in the sense that you are in between and not here or there, and also a space from which you can immediately be rejected. Within such an idea of the non-community, Parvez Modi finds that love marriages in India are fraught with different kinds of conflict and fissures that couples have to undergo. In her understanding of marriage, therefore, she deliberately brings in the idea of state and the law and the way in which law and state actively participate in the making of kinship and marriage. While we have discussed the role of the law and the state in kinship making earlier in our understanding of matrilineal descent groups in Kerala, where we studied how the colonial government enacted rapid laws in changing matrilineal descent groups and in their slow disappearance from Kerala society. Here too, the discussion of law and the state becomes very important in understanding how the state continues to mark us through its interference in the recognition of particular relationships and intimacy. Thus, in Parvez Modi's study, the idea of illegal regularity becomes very important. What is this notion of illegal regularity? Modi discusses that through the black letter law, illegal regularity operates through a whole stream of lawyers and legal functionaries who aim not to perform what is laid down in legislation. So even though a couple may approach a local court to marry through the Special Marriages Act, the process of marrying through the act makes it difficult for them to continue on the path. The Special Marriages Act, as per its injunction, requires couples to give a 30-day notice before the day of their marriage. This process also includes informing publicly that the couple intend to marry. Many of these couples elope from their respective homes to undertake a perilous path of marriage and intimacy. In such a situation, the Special Marriages Act becomes a huge obstacle to their dream of coming together. In many ways, therefore, couples are pushed by courts and touts, agents who operate in their favor to the quick fix 2-day marriage. Parvez Modi identifies the 2-day marriage as falling within the Hindu Marriage Act, where both couples are married in a temple and as per Hindu procedures. This also involves a collective misrecognition of the kind of ethnic and community backgrounds that the couples may be coming from. Thus, interreligious marriages become difficult to enact in the Special Marriage Act because of the state's connivance in positioning huge obstacles in the fulfillment of such marriages. So while legislation allows for such marriages to happen, the real workings of the law make sure that there are many obstacles to such marriages being enacted. This is particularly important in how Parvez Modi finds that in her ethnography, the use of rape is often used in place of elopement. A girl's parents often use particular notions and ideas to stop her from contracting the marriage with her lover. This is problematic in many ways because the state supports such forms of illegality by actually creating and constantly putting the norm at the forefront. Remember what we discussed in case of Kath Western and Judith Butler, and how in many ways the state is embedded in the reproduction of the norm. In many ways, the norm of the perfect marriage is something that is also socially embedded within community and family. Any deviation from the norm is something that the state is not really interested in. even though legislation in India suggests the protection of those who do not fall into the larger norm of heterosexual, community-oriented and supported marriage, the workings of legislation make sure that the norm is constantly reproduced. In many ways, Modi's work is critical in understanding how law and legislation work in India to reframe our notions of family and kin. Thus, some of the interesting features that she identifies through the Special Marriage Act and through her ethnography seem to be, first of all, the protection of religious freedom without the regulation of faith. The law affords that couples can enter into interreligious marriages without the support of their parents, but in its real workings it does not really happen. Similarly, the push for the two-day marriage means that the Special Marriages Act is never really enacted or performed. Every other marriage is pushed into a quick fix so that the couple can go back and solemnize their relationship without their parents coming to know and without affecting their elopement. She also finds that the effective workings of agents, minor law functionaries, police in such activities of legitimizing love marriages become an important node in understanding how intimacy works in contemporary urban India. These are very important points to think of how new kinship studies can be reframed. These do not fall within the gambit of what we have been studying, but offer new tools of thinking through marriage and blood itself. These are important ways in which we can think of modern day relationships without going back or falling into the trap of models that we have been studying till now, which may seem rather irrelevant. But what is important is that even though earlier models that we have studied may seem irrelevant, they need to be resurrected and critiqued to understand their relevance again within a modern format of relationships that are constantly changing. Thus, while in Modi's study the law and society connive together to make sure that couples engaging in non-community love marriages are not allowed to go ahead or marked as non-normative, in Shalini Grover's study of love marriages in slums in Delhi, the law is provoked in different ways. Grover finds very interestingly that women who reside in slums in North Delhi and are unhappy with their husbands may elope and leave the marriage permanently. However, for the husband they have left behind, this elopement can only be reversed or can be rejected through the act of the missing persons report. In the absence of a wife, the man is unable to divorce her, thereby stopping him from future alliances. In such situations, many of the men whose wives have left them go to the police, report a missing persons, file a missing persons report, and after a particular period of time, use the missing persons report as a divorce document. This is interesting in how law and state actually enters the intimate realm to reconfigure the ways in which relationships are made and remade. We have to also think of the way in which documents and legal documents come to be kinship documents as well. Samina Mullah, in her study of rape documents in American courts, suggests that legal documents, whether of marriage, of adoption, and other aspects of kinning, are also very important ways in which we think about our relationships. These legal documents, which are written in legalese, are actually ways and modes of understanding kinship and marriage. They cannot be discarded, but are important tools to enter into a more contemporary study of how marriage and biology are reconstructed in modern society. In such a sense, Shalini Grover's study also aims to look at how young women in slums in Delhi negotiate their lives in the face of unhappiness or bitterness with their current situation. Often local courts such as Mahila Adalats enter into the fray to make sure that intimate relations are protected or discarded depending upon the way in which the people involved in those relationships make meaning out of it. If we had to think of Bob Simpson in an interesting way, the translations from Divorce in England to that of Slums in Delhi make for very potent reading of how divorce and abandonment work in the understanding of marriage and kin. Within such a framework, it is important to understand how we think of marriage again. In Ravinder Kaur's seminal study of the Bengali bridal diaspora, she suggests that in India today, many Bengali women are seen across the country marrying into other communities. Ravinder Kaur's study suggests that Bengali women have been traditionally traveling to other parts of the country to marry men of other ethnicities, communities and religions because of the structural conditions of poverty and paucity back home. With families in Bengal having many daughters, the care for those daughters and the arrangement of dowry for their marriage becomes a critical way in which they negotiate their daughter's position in such marriages. Thus, Kaur finds that many Bengali families are willing to send their daughters to men and to families elsewhere outside Bengal without having to pay dowry and to create a sense of marital harmony for their daughter. These marriages may not be extremely suitable because often in the absence of the payment of dowry, the girl might be marrying an older man who's been previously married or one who has physical disabilities. But the idea of sending away your daughter without the payment of dowry also feeds back into structural economic inequalities. Thus, it's important to understand why Bengali women are actually traveling to other parts of the country to become brides for men belonging to other communities and ethnicities. This is an important understanding of how we think of kinship and marriage again. Kaur suggests that in North India, as the sex ratio deficit works against women, men are left with lesser women to marry. In such a situation, they have to look for women in other parts of the country to fulfill their marital responsibilities and conjugal responsibilities. This is where women from places such as West Bengal and Assam, where the sex ratio deficit has not been marked as much as it has in the north part of India, step in. Women from West Bengal, Assam and Kerala have been marrying men in places such as in places such as Haryana, Punjab and Rajasthan to make up for the deficit of women in these places. Thus, marriage relations therefore are coordinated through the payment of bride price rather than dowry. Here the men pay the women to become their wives. In such a situation of structural inequality, many women actually contribute to the notion of marriage, family and livelihood. Kaur suggests that this form of cross-region bridal diaspora is a kind of livelihood strategy that women undertake to overcome the poverty back home and actually link up to a notion of how they can go back home in peace. Many of them also send remittances back home after their marriage. It also helps their parents make homes for their girls without necessarily putting them in precarious positions such as prostitution or unhealthy work cultures in other cities. Through the fulfillment of the marriage contract and through the fulfillment of the social responsibility that a father has to marry off his daughter, Bengali fathers are able to marry their daughters off into other parts of the country in a more healthy and effective way, thereby making sure that their future is secured. This is not to say that the families they marry into in other parts of the country are secure or supportive, but it is a way out of precarity, poverty and a situation which is not healthy back home. In such a situation, as we can see, marriage and intimacy is constantly reframed and remarked. The study of kinship and family as we embark into a new space of urban and contemporary society is exciting and provides newer challenges. On this note and towards the next lecture, I will see you soon. Thank you.